I took a creative writing class in high school, and our teacher warned us against ever using certain phrases, which she deemed lazy and overdone. And in particular, we were prohibited from writing, "It just so happened," or anything like that at all. Because there's a temptation when, as a writer, you have one plot point that you're trying to connect to the next one, and you're just not sure how to move the story along, and so you consider using a crazy random happenstance. The problem is that it takes a very skilled writer, beyond the skills and talents of most high schoolers, to use such coincidences in such a believable way without the reader thinking, "Yeah, right." Now, obviously, the whole story that you're writing isn't real, but you want them to believe that it's real. This is what's called the suspension of disbelief, and it's critical for enjoying fiction. You have to believe that this is somewhat plausible, even if it's about wizards. But when something unusually unbelievable happens, you lose your audience, and it can ruin the entire story. But what if it turns out that the story isn't fiction at all? What if it's a true story? Nonfiction can be even more unbelievable, and it can get away with it because it's true. Mark Twain famously observed that it's no wonder that truth is stranger than fiction, because fiction has to make sense. There are several examples of movies or TV shows that are based on a true story, but they had to change something that actually happened because no one would believe it. And speaking of Mark Twain, he was born in 1835, which was the same year that Halley's Comet made its first appearance. And it just so happened that he died in 1910, the year that Halley's Comet came back around again, which he actually predicted in 1909, saying, "The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." And sure enough, in 1910, he had a heart attack and died, right as Halley's Comet appeared again. Now, okay, Mark Twain was making a joke, but it's also no coincidence that he attributed such a coincidence to God, because sometimes that is the only explanation. And when something like that happens in fiction, it's called a deus ex machina, a term originally from the ancient Greek theater, which means God from the machines. And it used to refer to when an actor portraying one of the gods would be lowered onto the stage with a crane. Then they would suddenly resolve the story and bring about either a sad or a happy ending. Usually a sad, because that's how the Greeks rolled. But that's what it's called in fiction, a deus ex machina. But when that happens in real life, we call it a miracle. And that's what we're going to be seeing today in the story of Ruth. We are looking at the story of Ruth, a story of redemption. But it begins with tragedy. As I said last week, very often good stories begin with bad news. And in chapter 1, Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, became widows and were living in a time and place where it was very dangerous to be a widow. Their culture that they lived in placed the value of women on the men in their lives, and without husbands or sons, they were viewed as worthless. Naomi felt worthless. She felt abandoned by God, and she vocalized that verbally. But in the midst of her sorrow, Ruth demonstrated to Naomi faithful love, sitting beside her in her grief. And in doing so, Ruth demonstrated the faithful love of God. And here in chapter 2, we'll see how it just so happened that something good came next. Begin reading Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." And at this she bowed down her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, dip it in the wine vinegar." And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves. Don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until the evening, and then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it had amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother asked her, Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked for today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And she added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." And then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Did you see it? I tried to emphasize this in verse 3. The whole story hinges on "it just so happened." As it turned out, what a great coincidence that of all the fields in Judah, Ruth just so happened to wander into the field of Boaz. This could have turned out a lot worse for her, but it didn't. And it just so happens that not only is Boaz a great man, he also just so happens to be related to her. Now, their connection is not close by any means. He is her late husband's father's cousin. And that doesn't mean much to us today, but it did back then. Remember, this is a culture that basically had their genealogies and family trees memorized. Who you were and what family you belonged to, who you were descended from, was very important. And by the way, it just so happens that Boaz's mother was Rahab, the woman in Jericho who saved the 2 spies in the book of Joshua. Boaz was from the same clan, a subdivision of the 12 tribes, but a little bigger than an extended family. He was from the same clan as Elimelech. And back then, your clan was your community. In a wild and dangerous world, a clan provided for one another as a community, and they protected one another as needed. And this was especially true for widows, who had no one else to provide for them. But fortunately for them, God had already commanded God's people to leave enough room, leave enough food for those who needed it. It was a practice called gleaning, and the law of Moses required it. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19 tells us, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. And remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Because of this, Ruth was able to follow along Boaz's harvesters and pick up the grain that they missed, dropped, or left behind. And once again, as it turns out, Boaz happened to show up just then to the fields and greeted the harvesters. And as it turns out, he took notice of Ruth. He had heard about her. Everyone in town was talking about Naomi, but they couldn't talk about Naomi without talking about her daughter-in-law that left everything to stay by her side. Boaz was so impressed with Ruth's faithful love for Naomi that he extended his hospitality and generosity to ensure that Ruth was taken care of and that no harm would come to her. And in doing so, he invoked the name of God, from whom his hospitality and generosity overflowed, saying, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And after eating more than she had eaten in a very long time, Ruth went home with something around 30 pounds of grain. And Naomi couldn't believe it. Where did you go? Where did all of this come from? And Ruth responded, Boaz. And that is where the story of Naomi reaches a vital turning point. Do you remember Naomi's venting and lamenting from chapter 1? She had cried out, "The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune to me." And now, here in chapter 2, she exclaimed, "The Lord bless him. The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." All from one chapter. How did she get from point A to point B? Well, it was a deus ex machina. God showed up. And as we talked about last week, throughout this whole story, God doesn't say a single word. God doesn't speak through any clouds or through any burning bushes. There are no signs or wonders in this. But in this story, God doesn't have to. God showed up through God's continuing, faithful presence. Naomi felt abandoned, but God, like Ruth, had never left her side. And sometimes it takes a coincidence for us to realize that. And you can call it a coincidence. You can call it a deus ex machina. But you can also call it a miracle. And it is the miracle of hope. In the midst of the pain of sorrow, in the desert of despair, where it seemed nothing good would grow, hope sprouted from the dry ground. This story is only halfway through, but we can already see that it's leading to a happy ending. Naomi saw it. And for the first time in a very long time, she was excited about what was going to happen next. Boaz was their redeemer, their guardian redeemer. And we'll talk more about this next week. But this was just another one of those, it just so happens. Coincidences happen. And sometimes they are just coincidences. But sometimes they are more than that. And I will confess to you that I often struggle to discern the difference. I'm a man of faith, but I can also be cynical and skeptical. And sometimes when others claim something to be an act of God, I have a hard time suspending disbelief. I don't have any tattoos, but if I ever did, I've always said that if I would get the words of the man in Mark chapter 9 saying, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And sometimes I feel like that way when people talk about saying this was obviously an act of God. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And sometimes the Lord does. Recently, I experienced the coincidence that I've heard that some of you have experienced when an unexpected bill was met with an unexpected check in the mail, which just so happened to be the exact same amount that I needed. Was that a coincidence, or was that an answered prayer? Well, there have been times in the past where I didn't receive the check in the mail, even though I wish I had. Was this time different, though? Was God telling me something now that He didn't tell me earlier? I'm honestly not sure. But what I can tell you is that when that coincidence happened recently, I needed a miracle of hope. And that I needed a reminder of God's presence. God was already there. But God provided me a miracle to show me, to open my eyes so that I can see. And that is what makes the difference. And that's why I'm sharing that story with you. Because we need to share and hear such stories. And we might struggle to believe, but we don't struggle to hope. I don't struggle to hope. These "it just so happened" moments help us to glean and gather the hope that we need. My friend John Mark Hicks has experienced loss like Naomi and Ruth did. Yesterday was the 42nd anniversary of the death of his first wife, Sheila, who passed away suddenly when they were both far too young. John Mark is now a professor of theology at Lipscomb University, and he has reflected and written on this extensively, and I highly recommend his book, Anchors for the Soul. Well, on social media yesterday, John Mark shared that in 2009, he experienced what he called a significant turning point in the journey toward healing, very similar to what Naomi experienced. For the first time in many years, he visited his wife's grave to sit, pray, and reflect. And his grief counselor had recommended journaling, which he says was often difficult for him, but on that day, he wrote for 2 hours. And yesterday, he shared what he wrote in his journal back in 2009, which I'd like to read part of for you. When I sat down, the clouds were ominous. They were dark and brooding. I anticipated rain, and the forecast called for it. I wondered whether I would have to sit in the car and journal. As I began journaling, I wrote that the dark clouds were a metaphor for how I felt sitting next to her. Sadness filled my soul, and tears flowed. As I was writing and thinking about that metaphor, feeling my way through it, the sky changed. The clouds were still there, but a hole had opened up among them. And that hole was situated directly above the cemetery, and the sun lit Sheila's grave. And it was as if the whole cemetery was engulfed by the blue sky and its bright sun. And at the same time, I felt a gentle, cool breeze flowing over me, a calm wind, a peaceful breath. God, I wrote, is this for me? The dark clouds began moving to the northeast, but the blue sky stayed directly overhead. The sun was so bright at times that I could barely write. I needed sunglasses, but had none. There were still plenty of clouds, but not over Sheila's grave. The bright sunlight continued unabated. God, I wrote, are you telling me something? As I was driving down Highway 52 to turn into the parking lot at the Methodist Church, I noticed how dark the clouds were, and I thought to myself, how fitting. It was how I always anticipated coming here, sad, depressing, upsetting. Consequently, I tended to avoid the grave. God, I wrote, are you telling me my life has been dark too long, that it is time to see the light? The trees whistled with a pleasant wind. The sun dispelled the darkness. The warmth of the sun and refreshing breeze renewed me. The sun's warmth sent my heart to God's love, and the breeze felt like the breath, the Spirit of God. My Father was blowing fresh grace on me, a fresh joy in the painful place with such painful memories. God, I wrote, you are here now. You are with me. There is peace. The dark clouds are moving away. I know not whether you believe in such experiences, but that was my experience yesterday. It was as real to me as typing this sentence. I've had them before, and this one was simply amazing, wondrous, and beautiful. Is my grieving over? I doubt it. But I think it reached a new stage yesterday. It was a moment of grace and joy when all I expected was fear and sadness. Is this God's grace? I wrote with tear-filled eyes. Yes, indeed it was. Thank you, God. I just so happened to read those words last night as I was struggling to write a sermon about coincidences. And I thanked John Mark for sharing that story, which was helpful and hopeful for me. And I told him that maybe me reading it then, maybe it wasn't a coincidence. He simply replied, there are no coincidences. And I don't know if I believe that, but I definitely hope it. In the midst of pain, through this miracle of hope, John Mark encountered the presence of God's faithful love and the peace that comes with it in a time that he needed it. Have you experienced that? Have you experienced what Naomi and Ruth and John Mark did? Have you been given a miracle of hope? Share your stories. Don't be afraid and don't be embarrassed. No matter how great or small these miracles might be, they are beautiful. And we need that hope now more than ever. We need to cling to the blessed hope that God is with us here, and God is with us now, and God is with us always. For that is the gospel we are preaching, and the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. Church, we are doing so with our hope. And maybe it just so happened that you needed to hear this today. And maybe it's a coincidence, but maybe it isn't. And if you are in need of that hope, that joy, the love and peace that Jesus offers us, we would love to tell you more. Let us know. And if you are in need of prayer and encouragement, if you are in need of hope, we are here for you. May God's presence be seen and heard and felt in us and through us, and in all things may our God receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.